Hello, my name is Charvon Carlson, and this is the first in the series that I like to call Talking to Myself. How I came up with this idea is that I love to research um, various different things for various different reasons, for various different information. And my friends and family get a little exhausted listening to me talk about what the latest thing that I've discovered or researched. A little bit about me, or a little bit of my background. Um, I am an active member of spiritualism. I'm a spiritualist, and the past few years, my focus has been on various different pioneers and spiritualists at the time. But for today's talk, I want to talk about two African American and Indigenous women of spiritualism. Um, because little known and little talked about in our religion. And the two women that I've chosen to talk about today, um, well, the research I did was fascinating. But again, like I stated earlier, um, people tend to be like, really? That's great. Now, can we talk about something else? I also do ancestry research, been doing that for, oh my gosh, well, for decades. Um, mine basically anybody who shows up with a tree, I'm more than happy to help you figure it out at times. Um, and I do various other things, as you can tell, like so. I have a full time job. I have, and so on. But I don't really want to get into, my personal because who cares, right? And if you happen to come across this, you probably came across it because you wanted to learn about these two people that I'm about to talk about. Um, normally, I'm going to try, not normally, I'm going to try and share my screen, but I'm not very organized because I wanted this to be very organic and not feel like this a stern lecture and conversation, but just a really just a casual talk between friends, me and me. So the first person I wanted to talk about is Reverend Bertha Crear. Now, when you're researching her, you're hard pressed to find them using the term Reverend in front of her name. Reverend Bertha Crear was born in about 1877 through 1879, depending on the record you're looking at. Yes, I created a family ancestry tree for her. So there are a couple records. One has her born in 1869, and one has her born in 1879, and one, what have you. Those discrepancies aren't uncommon when you're doing ancestry research. So you got to kind of go with what else you find around there about her family or relatives or whatever, and you kind of pinpoint a date. And I'm going to go ahead and pinpoint her at about 1878, which is kind of the middle between 1877 and 79. The 1869 one, um, I think that was just a clerical error by the census taker. Really, I don't, um, because everything else in her paperwork is consistent with her being born somewhere between 1877 and 1879. Um, so she was born in 1879, 1878. We're going to go with 1878. She was born in 1878 in South Charleston, Ohio. Um, now, her parents, though, her father was born in Virginia and her mom was born in Kentucky. Now, you may wonder why would one person from Virginia and a person from Kentucky end up in Ohio and have a kid? Well, we're talking Civil War slavery. So, if by giving you the dates of her parents' birth, um, hold on a second because I didn't have it up on my screen when I started this conversation. Her dad was born in 1860 and her mom was born in 1861. So, with her dad and her mom born pre Civil War, that means they were born into slavery. And that means her grandparents were slaves And based on the records I have, at least her grandmother was still alive after slavery. And when they migrated to Ohio, she migrated with them. Now, it's not uncommon that when slavery ended, that there would be the walk towards going towards the north. Ohio is a very common place for a lot of people from the South to migrate to, um, whether black or white. Um, I mean, as people know about the stories about those who migrated from the Appalachian Mountains, and they were white, indigenous, not indigenous, they were white people from the Appalachian Mountains that migrated to Ohio for better work, for better pay, what have you. So and she's from the Kentucky area, so that makes sense that her family would have migrated to Ohio and then kind of stayed in Ohio because it was north without being too north. It's still on the line that if they had to go back home to visit family or what have you, they could. And I'm sure that, and I haven't done the deeper research of this because for me personally, I have no family that I found so far from the Kentucky, Ohio area. So I'm giving, so don't take my word for gospel in terms of migration, but I'm assuming that once slavery ended, her mother's side people decided to migrate to Ohio. Now, in terms of her dad's side probably were again slavery's ended. Probably decided to migrate to Ohio as well from Virginia. They meet up, which is not hard to meet up. They're still in those times. You're still relatively segregated. You're still relatively treated as other, being black. And the Civil War and the end of the Civil War did not, as we know, and even today, did not automatically make people see black people as human beings. Um, we became people to be tolerated, not necessarily people in a lot of sense. However, so when they would migrate to areas where others like them lived, and more likely that's how they met. Probably heard of a job up north, heard a friend of a cousin, or someone said, if you go here, and that's probably what happened. If I look at the 1880 census, which would be she's about 2 or 3 on this census, they were already in Ohio, her parents, and her parents' income. So here in this 1880 census, she's there with her mom and living with her mom's father and her mom's mother. So more likely than not, the whole family decided to go north together. In Ohio, we know now that Ohio's technically not really north, but in those times, that was considered going north. I mean, you're from Kentucky, you're going north. And here on the census, they're laborers, which basically means that when they got up there, they just probably worked whatever jobs that they could get, and they were doing labor, manual labor. Um, to move forward, at some point, her father dies. I don't have an exact date and I haven't yet to find her dad's death certificate, but he apparently transitions somewhere around 1890, between 1890 and 1896, because now we move into the 1900 census, where Bertha Crear is now a widow living at home with her mother. And her mother is remarried. And that, again, that's not uncommon. It's not uncommon no matter what race you were. Women tend to be seen that if your husband happens to die or what have you, you should get married again. It's very rare to find women and men. Men were the same way, who would stay single after their partner died. Same thing today. I mean, not really different. Um, so then we move into so that's in 1900. She's now moved in with her. She's living with her mom. She's a widow now for the first time. Um, I'm we are, I am educating, guessing that her maiden name at the time was Pickett. No, her married name, her first husband's maiden name, not hers. Her first husband's surname was Pickett, and went from Bertha Smith because her maiden name, the name she was born under, was Bertha Smith. And then she goes from Bertha Smith to Bertha Pickett. Then somewhere between 1900 and 1918, her and Pickett are no longer together. Well, Pickett's gone at 1900. She remarries again to a Greggs. I still haven't been able to find his first name. And in that time that she's married to Greggs is when she apparently discovers she's a medium. So between 1900 and about 1918, she begins her journey in becoming a spiritualist, a member of the National Spiritualist Association. She gets her ministry sometime between 1910 and 1914. She's serving her churches in that time frame. And then in 1916, she becomes pastor of her own church called the Christian Spiritualist Church in Ohio. At about 1917, she's now being known as a spiritualist in the National Spiritualist Association, a medium, a well recognized medium. For those records, her last name is Gregg. And so between about 1910 and 17, you're going to find Bertha Gregg in the newspaper articles in connection to her work as a spiritualist in that time frame. And then as we move on to 1918 is when she gets married, and I have her marriage certificate, and this is her third marriage. We're not sure what happened to Gregg. I don't know if he transitioned or he just, I don't know. I don't have his first name. That's gonna be a digging for a while to figure out where they're. We know Pickett died because she's listed in the census in 1900 as a widow. However, we don't know what happened to Gregg. He just, and that's not his first name, that's his last name. Don't know where he went. But she's remarried in 1918 to Charles O. Creer. And then she's known from this point on as Reverend Bertha Crear. Um, so, some fascinating things about Reverend Bertha Crear. Besides her involvement with the National Spiritualist Association, which is now today called the National Spiritualist Association of Churches, the NSAC. But this is when it was NSA. She was a very active member of the association. She not only had her credentials as pastor, but she also was a missionary, the national missionary for the NSA. Also, during this time, you see from various different little newspaper articles or snippets in the different Ohio papers, where whenever she spoke, whenever she was scheduled to speak or serve a church, whether her own or work with others, which was often done, um, she drew in a large crowd into her churches. When they said Reverend Bertha Crear will be residing and doing mediumship tonight, they came in large numbers in that area. So she was very popular and well known. Now, reading one of the convention transcripts from that time frame, they list her as the missionary for recruiting colored people into the religion. However, they also talk about her extreme popularity with white people, Europeans of that time. She was very popular on both sides of the line. She was very popular with colored people. She was very popular with white people. She was just very, very popular, and she was apparently very, very talented. She was so popular with the NSA is that when she transitioned, in 1927 is when she transitioned, sadly, they did a full kind of remembrance of her and what is now the National Summit. Um, 1922 though was her. I'm going to guess for Reverend Bertha Crear was a high and a low year for her. She starts off the year where the NSA has decided that she is going to be a representative out of three people that they selected to go to the International Congress of Spiritualism in London. Yep, she's got to get on a steamboat. um, and it, and so she applied, and I have her passport application and her return trip because she went to she left Liverpool, and I know her return trip is. I know she went to London because on her return trip, she went from Liverpool to Quebec, and then from Quebec back into the United States and going back to Ohio. It's also the year where, um, well, let me back up a little bit. It's also the year that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle comes to visit America and does like his tour. And in his tour, he talks about one of the pieces he talks about Bertha Crear being a excellent representation and resource for colored people who might be interested in spiritualism, and that they had an excellent person in Reverend Bertha Crear to go to. So that was pretty exciting to read that she's mentioned by Sir Conan Doyle as an excellent medium, as an excellent resource to spiritualism, as an excellent reason to come into spiritualism. During that tour, he had specifically one of the things he had written. And what I'm talking about is that Sir Conan Doyle wrote himself his experiences and thoughts about his journey through the Americas from East Coast to West Coast, and he submitted this article to the newspapers, and the newspapers reprinted it the way he wrote it. So he wrote his own article for the papers, telling his own experience and about his trip and what he saw and what he didn't saw, what he liked, what he didn't like, and what have you. Part of this trip is that he was very curious to talk to other Negroes, those that were on the trains, because he is traveling from San Francisco back to the East Coast was by train, and talking to other Negroes, the waiters, the bell people, the servers, what have you, anyone that was willing to talk to him and not freak out um, about what did they think, what were their ambitions, what were their goals. Now, mind you, this is during that great migration part, and now we're starting to ramp up into the Jim Crow era. We haven't quite hit Jim Crow era, but we're getting there. And his conclusion was, unlike his counterpart, he had an opposite view about people of color, and his conclusion was that they should be recruited here in the Americas to become part of spiritualism, that they had a great understanding and a gift, and that it would great help the spiritualist cause if they were members. And that is the part where he does mention Reverend Bertha Crear. Now, he was at the conference that she was at in London, and my imaginings is they might have come back together. They on the same boat. I mean, I can't imagine that there was like, it's not like today where you go to the airport and you can get a flight every 20 minutes. My imaginings is that they probably rode on the same boat back from from London coming back to the United States, because it's the same year that he does this traveling. The other thing that was very about Reverend Creer is that when Houdini decided to go after spiritualism to debunk us as we're frauds, you're a magician, dude. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. There was a full article called Houdini Attack is Unjust, Say Spiritualism Leaders, right? And they wrote this full article about spiritualism, why Houdini's wrong, and what have you, but signed at the bottom of this article is from the First Spiritualist Church, Reverend Walter Ripley. From the West Side Spiritualist Church, Reverend H.E. Boisler. And from the Christian Spiritualist Church, Reverend Bertha Crear. So we can imagine that in the 2022, with her extreme popularity within the NSA, and now with Sir Conan Doyle, who is from England, he's in the UK area. He's kind of connected to the SNU side of things, which is the Spiritualist National Union. You imagine that she had a great pull. Another thing that I had found about her in the paper, there's a few things I found, but one that really kind of stood out to me was that in 1929, a woman had transitioned. And in her will, she had stated that $1,000 was to go to Reverend Creer's church, and $100 was to go directly to Reverend Creer. Now, unfortunately, Reverend Creer transitioned in 1927. And again, there's some deeper research that needs to be done to figure out what happened to her church after that. Were they able to relieve that? But that is a lot of money in 1929, right after the Depression. And we're still recovering from the Depression. It's not like we were like, oh, boom, we're done. No, I mean, there's, that still is a ripple effect that a Black woman would be in a white woman's will and not receive a small dollar amount. It's not like $10 or $5. It's $1,000, which I imagine, and by today's standards, is closer to $10,000, which is a lot of money for a spiritualist church. But that is how well loved and respected and loved she was. Another thing is that, which I found to be one of my favorite things to discover about Reverend Bertha Crear, which of course opens another can of worms. So if any spiritualists are watching this, you're probably all going, okay, I got this question and this. Okay, here's the thing. I can only find what I can find during COVID. And that's from home doing Google search. So this is all Google search from home. I promise that after this is all over, I will be hitting the archives and going to cemeteries and putting together a nice PowerPoint presentation to be presented much more formally in a more formal environment. But right now, this is just me talking to me, and you happen to be eavesdropping. So one of the really biggest, the succulent piece about Reverend Bertha Crear that I discovered, it was in the newspaper, and I want to get the year. It was also 1922. Now remember what I said. 1922 is a very good year in a way for Reverend Bertha Crear in terms of spiritualism, in terms of her recognition. She's just got back from England representing the NSA at the International Spiritualist Congress, which now would be the ISF, International Spiritualist Federation. I think that's the name. Please, again, don't quote me on it. I get things confused. I might have mixed the name around, but you guys get the gist of it. And I'm going to read exactly what the ad said. Reverend Bertha P. Crear, pastor of the Christian Spiritualist Church, has just received her diploma from the Spiritualist National Union, it being the first one ever given to an USA worker in spiritualism in America from Great Britain. For those spiritualists out there who are listening, I'm going to let you digest that. This Black woman in 1922 is the first American spiritualist to receive a diploma in the U.S. from the Spiritualist National Union in Great Britain, who was also at the time a very prominent member of the National Spiritualist Association, and a missionary for the National Spiritualist Association. That is a lot for a black woman in 1922 whose parents were born in slavery. That she was able to go from that background to this in just one generation. I'm just letting y'all process that. Because that's powerful information for me, and I'm sure it's powerful information for quite a few people. So now what I'm going to do is share my screen if I know what I'm doing so that you can see a picture of Reverend Bertha Crear, even though they put Mrs. But we're going to go with it. This is Reverend Bertha Crear. I imagine this picture was probably taken in 1922 or around that time. She's a beautiful woman, and she is an absolute treasure for me to have found in spiritualism. Then I want to, oh, you don't need to see all that. There's my genealogy research stuff. Here is the article of her receiving the first diploma in the Spiritualist National Union in the United States. And now I'm going to stop share. And I want to say, I just want to pause with that because finding that information for me was powerful as a spiritualist with the National Spiritualist Association of Churches, as a person who holds the National Spiritualist Teacher credential, the Certified Medium credential, the Commissioned Healer credential. This is my pioneer in a way, my ancestor in a way, not direct ancestor, but my pioneer. Knowing the work she did in such a short period of time, because we're talking somewhere between 1910 and 1922, that she went from a person who was a day laborer, married, husband died, remarried, found spiritualism, really got committed and dedicated to spiritualism, pastoring churches, being a mediumship, going out and sharing the love and the gift of spiritualism with anybody who listened to her, I'm pretty sure, who then got to travel to England and come back from England and hold a degree, actually acquire a diploma. And she is literally the first person in her family. Her parents were born in slavery. She's the first one in her family line to be born after slavery and to make these kinds of strides in the United States and to be guided and know that this is what she wanted to do. This is absolutely, warms the heart, warms the heart. I don't know if y'all can feel my energy, but whew, I'm happy. Now, to wrap things up, because again, I still have a lot more to research with her. This is just kind of like the tip of the iceberg. But she does transition in 1927. Now, let me back up a little bit because I know I'm jumping to the transition. The reason why 1922 becomes a very, very strong year for her of, I told you, the ups. She becomes the first American to receive a diploma. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle talks highly of her in the paper. When he wrote his own article, he speaks of her. She traveled to London as a representative for the NSA, one of only 3 people that traveled to London for that Congress. And you know that more likely than not, the NSA covered the cost and expenses for that travel. So that's her high for 1922. She's also in that year, her services in her churches and working in other churches is picking up. Her popularity is growing. She is well received. She is well loved. At the October convention of the NSA in 1922 is when they decide they want to talk about the Negro problem. So this is where the low comes in. This woman has dedicated and joined and become a spiritualist with the National Spiritualist Association. She has just had a banner year of recognition, of love, and of service. She shows up to her convention for her organization to be told that we would like to separate the colored people from our association. That would mean her. When she speaks up about it at that particular convention, when they bring it up, she said, "All right, I get it, but you got to give us a little time to get ourselves together so that we can be okay on our own." Now, mind you, it's not at the 1922 convention that it becomes official. It doesn't happen until 1925. There's a lot of acrimony, a lot of fighting, a lot of going back and forth, a lot of hurt feelings happening in that short time frame. And Reverend Creer at this point, I imagine now being a diploma holder with the Spiritualist National Union and being recognized by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who at the time was, honorary speaker and teacher, especially at the different conferences. My imaginings is that she would have probably, because she was resistant, was not in agreement with having the National Colored Spiritualist Association of Churches. She was not a fan of that idea at all. She wanted nothing to do with it. She was on the committee to help them transition and give them advice, but she had no intentions of joining, because as far as she's concerned, there was no color difference in spiritualism. As spiritualists, our auras and our energies, when we go to Summerland, what this color is has nothing, is not anything. We are not, this is just here in the material world, has nothing to do with the spirit world. So she was not interested in this separation. 1925, along with Mercy E. Caldawaller, sorry if I butchered her name. I've been butchering that name for years. I'm not sure I'm going to get it right until I meet her personally. She tells me exactly how to say it, which is not, well, she could show up in one of my meditations and be like, "This is how to say my name." And I will be more than happy to receive it. Her, Called the Water, and I think a few others at the 1925 convention surrender their credentials. So in my imaginings, when she finally 3 years later decides, okay, this is what y'all going to do, there's no, and it's written in the notes where it appears as if she realized there was nothing they were going to say or do that was going to prevent this from happening. They were making this happen. This was happening. And there's various other um, issues and other things involved in that, but I'm not going to go into that. That'll be reserved for my African Americans and Spiritualism talk that I'll be doing again. Oh my God, next in a couple months. But I actually won't be doing it like this between the two of us. It'll be a more formal setting. I'm probably gonna have to create a PowerPoint. I don't know. We'll see. We know how I am. Anyway, so in 1925, she surrenders her credentials to the NSA. My imaginings, again, this is more research to be done down the road, but this is what I'm doing right now. My imaginings is that she probably was planning to go and become part of the SNU and be an American representative of the SNU here in the United States. Because her husband was a middle class, He also started off as like a waiter. When they met, he was like a waiter. By the time and they got married in 1918. So within like 3 years, she not only rises up and has become an invaluable member and uh, excellent spiritualist of the NSA, he becomes one of the most well known. He becomes a funeral director, which is very common in middle class, um, which is very common in the African American culture because we didn't have anybody to bury us. So we actually had to come up with our own cemeteries, embalmers, people who would give us insurance and who would bury our people with the same dignity, love, and respect that our white counterparts were receiving from their undertakers. Again, Jim Crow laws are kicking in. This is the backlash against the end of the Civil War and freeing of slaves. I think y'all know this history, and if you don't, there are plenty of resources. I beg of you to learn it because this behavior, these actions will color everything that we know today about anything, including the NSAC and the SMU and whatever. As a spiritual side, these make they make a difference. They make a difference. Um, and so anyway, so in 1925 she surrenders her credentials. I'm guessing I have no proof yet. I'm guessing that more likely than not, she was in the process of being a representation for the spiritualists. I do know for the SNU, I do know that she was on the committee to help with the NCSA transition, but she was not in any way, shape, or form becoming a member of the NCSA. Unfortunately, she herself transitions at the age of 47-ish. Remember what I said, the time frame of when she was born. So somewhere between 45 and 50, she transitioned on May 12th, 1927. She dies of shock because of a surgery she had. She dies of something that, if only modern medicine, right? She had fibroids. They were probably large. They were probably causing her pain. They were the reason why she didn't have children by that point. Probably miscarried. I know because I had fibroids, but I luckily didn't have the pain problem. She's 47, so menopause is coming down that mountain, and that's around the time, same for me, where they got worse. And I was to have a surgery as well, but I didn't because I went right into menopause. Skip the surgery. Woohoo! Unfortunately, that was not the case for her. She went ahead and went to the surgery. It ended up costing her her life. She did not come. She did not come out alive. But in my final notes about her for this particular chit chat with myself, with you eavesdropping, Reverend Bertha Crear being the first woman of color out of slavery to be such a significant part of spiritualism, the history of our religion, here in the United States and in Great Britain, as being the first, not only American to get the SNU diploma, but the first Black woman from America to get the SNU diploma. And to be such a motivating and loved force of spiritualism, of her mediumship, and to be spoken highly of by various different people. And then even the NSA, even after she transitions in 1927, they write, as had referred to earlier, they write a long thanks and love and congratulations to her for and celebration of her life and her contribution to the organization during the short time that she was here with us. If you are interested and want to know more about Reverend Bertha Crear, or you even know more and would like to share with me, please do. I don't know how you're going to do it, but you're going to share it because if you're watching this on YouTube, you know how to share it. There's a comment section, I'm sure, underneath this video. If nobody hears this, that's great. I will be talking about it. It'll be folded into my African American spiritualism discussion. Um, Today is just me talking about the two women that right now are just making my heart make our heart sing. So we now move on to the next spiritualist, and I'm sure she's not the first one. However, I remember being asked a while ago, did we ever have any Native Americans who were a member of spiritualism? Because we all know about the Native American guide everybody got. Now y'all need to work on that. Now I'm not saying that you don't have one, but I am saying appropriation, uh, revering something because it's different, personal biases, unconscious biases may have a little to do with why every other person has a Native American spirit guide. Because the truth of the matter is, and this is just my opinion, take it for what you will. However, I didn't understand that. My phone wants to join in the conversation. She didn't understand it either. My opinion is that our spirit guides and teachers, first of all, in my opinion, don't actually carry any, they don't take their human assignment with them. Us putting them in a human form, us putting our guides and teachers into these human forms. I'm not saying that they weren't once here, walked on the earth plane. We can have a spirit. I mean, just like if I want to learn about plumbing, I don't want a Native American spirit guide who never did plumbing. I want someone who was a plumber. If I'm trying to educate myself about, pick a thing, does it make sense that the person that educates you is a Native American spirit guide? I'm just saying. It's the guy in the war hawk in the full war suit or the peace pipe or whatever creation you have created that person into. Does that make sense for whatever it is you're working on in your spiritual development and journey and connection with the spirit world? That all of them are Native American guys. I'm just saying. Especially when spiritualism, the belief in the afterlife, the belief in ancestors, the belief in spiritual development and growth and da-da-da, is such a global and archaic, all the way to the big dawn of time, creation. And while I'm sure there were Native Americans during Jesus Christ's time, they don't talk about Native Americans in the Bible. I'm just pointing that out. They don't call them, the Indian chief or what have you. So again, I'm just saying, kind of take a moment and understand that everybody who claims to have a Native American spirit guide may not actually have a Native American spirit guide. And as a person who does ancestry and ancestry research, and this is not any color that I'm picking on. So don't think this. I'm only talking to white people. There are black people who do it. There are people of various different ethnicities, backgrounds, and cultures that do the same thing. So breathe. Everybody's guilty. Everybody's got unconscious bias, including me. I'm constantly working to unpack it. I'm just helping you to also make that decision as well. So let's move on though. So this would be someone who actually was Native American and Black. Nellie Mae Taylor, who was born March 9th, 1910 in Shawnee, Oklahoma. Mother was full-blood Choctaw. Her mother with her, along with her family, were product of reservations during that time where they grabbed all the indigenous people and shoved them into reservations. And her mother was one of the children that were shoved into the finishing schools for the indigenous children, which is depressing and sad, and for a whole other reason. Again, I'm not going to really go into that right now. However, there is plenty of literature and work and written educational moments in the world for you to be able to educate yourself on that. But just keep that in mind. So she is half Choctaw, Nellie Mae Taylor, and half African descent. Her father was a black man, and we don't really have where he's from Oklahoma, more likely than not part of a migration to Oklahoma, which is not unusual. Again, as I was pointing out earlier when we were talking about Reverend Bertha Crear, um, being, um, hold on, there we go. Um, After the Civil War, they would have migrated north. Their idea of north, if you're coming from Texas, I believe her father was born in Texas. When he's coming from Texas at the end of the Civil War, they would have moved to Oklahoma. It wouldn't have been just Africans, obviously. It would be also white Europeans, but Oklahoma was the state that they would pretty much migrate to because that was considered north. As we know today, it's not really, but and relationship to where they were coming from to where they went. This is north. This is land of the free, home of the brave, kind of thing, an opportunity to make more money and to have a better life and self-guided life, no longer being slaves. So they settle. So apparently, her mom and her dad meet up somewhere, in Oklahoma area around Shawnee, which is where the reservation was, and so on. And they were of Choctaw descent. No, not descent. They were Choctaw. Um, and it's there that Nellie Mae in 1910 is conceived. And her maiden name is Walker, Nellie Mae Walker. Um, Again, I'm just going to go over brief touching points on the early years of Nellie Mae. It is about I'd say somewhere between 1920 and 1930 that she goes to college to become a foreign missionary. She goes for about 2 years. After that, she doesn't actually graduate, but after that she just changes her mind, and in 1933 in Tulsa decides to join the National Colored Spiritualist Association. At least that's what's written in the book that I've read about her. I'm guessing it was a first person account, a conversation that they had with her. As she says that it was about 1933 when she decided to become a member of the National Colored Spiritualist Association of Churches, because when she tried to join the National Spiritualist Association of Churches, um, they didn't allow black people, which we know that's a direct result of what happened in 1927 at the NSA convention. Somewhere in there is when they become Association of Churches. See where I'm going? Um, and we know that stays in effect until Jim Crow, till the end of the Civil Rights Movement. Okay, so, but this is pre-Civil Rights Movement, but this is post-slavery. Tulsa, Oklahoma is also the home of where the Tulsa, I want to get this right. Should have pulled this up earlier, but I didn't because I was just having a little chat with myself. Tulsa Massacre. So in 1921 is when the Tulsa, Oklahoma massacre happens, race massacre happens, or the Tulsa riot, where based on someone saying some black guy did this to some white woman or something along that line. Um, a white mob attacks the residents in the homes and businesses of Black Greenwood neighborhood of Tulsa, Oklahoma. This happens between May 31st and June 1st of 1921. It lasts for 18 hours. Greenwood is considered the Black Wall Street. At the time, Nellie Mae is uh, 11 or 12 when this happens. If I know how to add, maybe 13. And her husband, whom she later marries, H.G.B. Taylor, um, is a little bit older than that, and he had businesses on Greenwood, so his businesses were affected. He was part of his family were well established in that Greenwood district where his family businesses were part of the businesses that were destroyed during that race riot. So somewhere between, but they're both still in Tulsa, probably trying to rebuild, trying to figure out what they're going to do next. But I think it gets hard for them, along with other African Americans in that area, where there begins a migration into Arizona, specifically the Phoenix area. 1934 is when her and H.G.B. Taylor marry in Tulsa. And then about by 1940, they are now in Tulsa. I mean, no, they are now in Phoenix, Arizona. In an article written about H.G.B. Taylor and his contribution to Greenwood and his family's contribution to that area and what happened, um, mind you, H.B. Taylor was much older than um, Reverend Nellie Mae Taylor. Uh, she was his third wife at this point. And let's see. Ugh, he is, he's 32 and she's 20. I don't know. He's much older. He's 32 at the time that they get married, and she's closer to 20 something by the time they get married. Anyway, by 1940, in the 1940-ish range, they moved to Arizona, where in 1935 she discovers. Now she claims that at the age of 35, but if I were to do the age according to her birth date and the articles written about her and timeline, they don't match in terms of her introduction to spiritualism and when she becomes part of spiritualism. I think what people tended to do in those times is that they pick a date, pick a, kind of thing. Um, and it's after 1940 when they um, moved to Arizona. And if we were going with when she was 35, she wasn't in Arizona yet. And we know that she didn't become a part of spiritualism until she got to Phoenix. So somewhere between 1942 or so, 1946 is when she moves to Phoenix, and she's a billet reader. She actually is a trance medium who has her spirit guide is Great Eagle. And remember what I brought up earlier about everybody having the Native American spirit guide? This actually makes sense given that she is half, 50% Choctaw. That she would have a Native American spirit guide, that Great Eagle would probably be one of her ancestors. That makes complete sense given her DNA. Um, and so she becomes my first Native American. Now, mind you, if you notice, I go Native American, Indigenous, um, because, and I use those terms interchangeably because I have the habit of saying Native American. However, Indigenous, I feel like could be better said. by no means am I trying to offend anyone. Obviously, they're not a monolith. And I notice how I say Choctaw because that is the tribe that that according to her mother's records, um, DNA records from Ancestry, that is the tribe that she is listed as being a member of, is the Choctaw. Actually, no. The tribe she's listed, I'm going to be correct, even more correct. The tribe she's listed as being a member of is the absentee Shawnee. I don't know what that means, but that's what they put on the census. And then on the Native American citizens and freedmen, she is listed as being part of the Choctaw. So somewhere, I'm sure there's a lot more idiosyncrasies and a lot more drilling down in there. I did not do that. So I'm staying with Native American Indigenous as to not give you guys like, oh, she's Cherokee or oh, she's Chuck. No, there's more layers to that than that. And I'm sure that there's someone out there who probably knows way more than me and can even get even more deeper and more detailed. And I totally respect and am welcome and open to receiving that information because if nothing else, I want to be as correct and accurate about people in our history as we can. Um, However, one of the things you will notice is that during her time when she becomes a spiritualist and during the time she goes by black. And now mind you, back in those days and even today, if you had any black level of black blood in you, the one drop rule, you're black. Even if you are 50-50, you're black. No one talks about her Native American indigenous side at all. They only talk about her being black because that's what she looked like. She looked like a black woman as far as they were concerned. Her proximity to the Native indigenous culture was not considered or thought about because we're only going by what we see, and we see a black woman. And to bring that into modern times, think about what people think about Kamala Harris, Senator Kamala, Vice President elect Kamala Harris. A lot of people will call her black, and she calls herself black as well. But again, this is a woman who is Southeast Asian and black 50-50. But because of what she looks like, they're always going to refer to her as the black woman. We are doing better in our day and age of being more respectful and honorable of multiple cultures that we as black people incorporate and embrace. But we've got a long way to go before before they stop using the paper bag test and the one drop rule. In this time, about night, she okay. So give me a second. So again, she moves to Arizona with her husband, H.G.B. Taylor, who I told you about. With his family and him were a distinct part of the Greenwood Tulsa riots. When they get there, he becomes a pastor of spiritualism. She becomes a pastor of spiritualism, and they open a church called the Taylor Memorial Interracial Spiritualist Church. What's interesting about this for me is she names the church after him, obviously, and he dies roughly uh, about 5 years or so after they moved to Tulsa. I mean, after they moved to Phoenix, Arizona, after the church was open. Um, and she doesn't remarry anymore after that. She does end up having a partner who lives with her, Miss Louise Washington, who at one point was on the board of her church. Um, and I say partner, she could have been a best friend. I'm using it in a more global term of could have been a best friend, could have been a lover, anywhere in between. Um, Not in a specific, she was a partner. Um, it could have been just something where she didn't want to remarry. She never had children of her own, but she didn't want to live alone. And Miss Louise Washington could have been just a really good friend who said, you know what, I don't ever want to get married. And there are people like that even today. And so I'll live with you, and we'll just tell people I'm taking care of you. We'll leave it at that. And for the most part, they weren't, from what I can tell from articles in the paper or whatever, they were not bothered. Or I mean, there might be more rumors or whatever in the personal life, but not bothered by it. Now, Reverend Nellie Mae Taylor's contribution to spiritualism. Not only does she start her own church, not only does um, she dedicates her life to spiritualism, to being a spiritualist. Um, a Reverend Ford, who was an NST, because he's listed as Reverend Ford, NST, who had his own church, I believe it was the Harmony Church, was her her mentor, so to speak, in helping her establish the Taylor Memorial Interracial Spiritualist Church, getting her board together. There are different pictures that I found throughout um, going through the different newspaper articles where he's in the back and they list him as the, kind of like a mentor type relationship in terms of helping her establish and create and keep abreast the Taylor Memorial Interracial Spiritualist Church. She also then becomes an active member of the National Colored Spiritual Association. Remember the one that we talked about that happened in 1926 that split off, that Reverend Bertha Crear did not want to be a part of, but would be helpful in terms of trying to help them establish themselves. She becomes a member of that to the point where at some point she becomes vice president of the National Colored Spiritualist Association of Churches. The other thing of tying her with the NSA, though, is that Reverend Ford is not the only spiritualist pastor mentor that she has from the National Spiritualist Association of Churches. Um, there was another Reverend from Oregon who was a trans medium who would come and and speak at the conventions. She had Reverend Ford who would visit her at her church and speak. She would speak at his church. And there were others. I don't have all of their names, but those were the two that stuck out the most with me and made the most difference. Um, the other thing is that besides being like falling in love with spiritualism and being a spiritualist from day one, it being a part of who she was, being a billet reader, she said that she'd had this gift or this ability since she was young, but didn't know what it was, didn't know what to do with it. Remember, her mother is now being pushed into those finishing schools. So she's not connected to probably the spiritual side of the Native American belief systems and being taught it because at the time it's being forced out of them. And her mother was part of those orphans because the census I find she's listed with like 50 to 100 other people of various different ages, and this is not her family. And they're all kids. So, and knowing the history, knowing that they had these finishing schools for indigenous culture to make them more civilized on a reservation, we know her mother may not have, by the time she marries and integrates with the Black community in Tulsa, may not bring that out, may not be able to or willing to from the suffering that she probably witnessed during her time. Which then in turn means Nellie Mae is also may not have received that tradition, or maybe she did. This is just an assumption she may have, but given the times and how hated and mistreated indigenous culture was done, how African culture that was brought, the little that they could bring with them when they were brought over during the Middle Passage, was erased from them or made to think bad and ugly voodoo or what have you. Um, in order for her to feel successful and feel like she's going to be a successful individual, her choice, her decision was the spiritualist church felt the most sense to her. And it's where she was able to make sense of her gifts. And because there were white people who were also spiritualists, that made her feel like this is a religion I could be a part of, where um, I'm not the only one, and I'm not the only black person or the only native person, or you know how that gets. It's an interracial, it's interculture. She purposely named her spiritualist church the interracial church because, and I'm pretty sure it's because of her connections and her bonds with other spiritualists in the area, especially Reverend Ford, who were instrumental in helping and guiding, helping her get started and get her church up and running, allowing her to speak at different services and things that they had. Also, during this time, she was an activist, very consistent with our pioneers, right? So she was a African activist. She was and I'm going to read her list. She ran for state rep, District 8 in Phoenix. She was a member of the Knights and Daughters of Tabor. She was a member of the Phoenix Urban League. She was a member of the Greater Phoenix Council for Civic Unity. She was a member of the NAACP. She was a member of the Republican Women's Club. She was a member of the Republican Precinct Committee person. And she was the pastor of her own church and a trans medium and vice president and member of the National College Spiritual Association of Churches. The most fun thing I read was that in 1961, when she went down to Florida for the NCSA's convention, she closed her church for 5 weeks. And the reason why this is a little giggly and fun is that anybody who shows up who happens to be a member of the National uh, Association of Churches knows that none of our churches will close for 5 weeks to participate in convention. That's only a week long. So I'm guessing some vacationing was happening too, which is totally fine. And more likely than not, a vast majority of the members of her church probably did attend convention as well. So if you only got 2 people left, what do you open a church for? And they probably all said, and while we're there, let's have some vacation. I'm sure there were people who had family down there. Remember what I said about migration. The migration continued. The turn of the century was one migration, and then I believe it was post World War I or right before World War II, there was a second migration from the south to the north. But everyone still had some form of family members who not only did not migrate, but didn't go the same places you did. So even though her father's people came from Texas, his his uncles, aunts, and uncles, or grandmother, or whatever, could have went to Florida. I mean, we don't know. But at any rate, so going to Florida and traveling time. Traveling time during the 1960s is nothing compared to traveling time in today's day and age. Um, so that was the funnest thing I read about her. She does transition in 1997 on January 26th, and she is buried at the Greenwood Memorial Lawn Cemetery in Phoenix, Arizona. Her contribution to spiritualism is also huge. There is also, which I found lovely, is that in the summit, they got permission. They had someone they knew who knew her and got permission to submit. Here it is. It was extraordinary evidence, physical phenomena. The photograph on this page is a reproduction of a colored Polaroid enlargement, which hangs in the Taylor Memorial Interracial Spiritualist Church in Phoenix. This is in 1977, so her church was still open. Actually, her church was open into the 1990s. Unfortunately, until I can make a physical trip to Phoenix, Arizona. I don't know where the church is now or what's happened to the paperwork that was probably part of that church. There's a lot more. Again, this is something else that we can tell you. So anyway, she They represent an unusual manifestation credited to the late co-founder, Miss Lily Mae Washington. So this is my first um, reference to Miss Lily Mae Washington, which was her not only co-founder of her church, but lived with her, that she transitioned in 1977. Then by 1997, so Reverend Taylor apparently was alone in the last 10 or so years. Lived alone, maybe. Again, don't know. It's all speculation until I get more information, which I don't have yet. But anyway, Reverend Charles Jessup of Houston, Texas, arranged with Pastor Reverend Nellie Mae Taylor to borrow the print. And I'm going to push it up at the camera. And here is the print. The number of lilies, or the white lines on this picture, were equal to the number of people who were at the service that evening. So, again, she was an integral part of not just the National Colored Spiritual Association of Churches. She was well known among the National Spiritualist Association. She is, for me, the first African Indigenous spiritualist and reverend. And like Bertha Crear, like Reverend Bertha Crear, she was a pioneer and forming her own churches, establishing relationships, and working across racial lines during a time that people were still pitting each other against black and white. Bertha Crear, I believe that if she had made had stayed, her activism was pushing for spiritualism to be a part of everyone's life, irregardless of race, and wanting it to be something where everybody would celebrate and practice together, not separate. For Reverend Nellie Mae Taylor, it was the same vision and dream, which is why she called her church the interracial church, because that meant that it didn't matter what color you are, you were welcome here at my spiritualist church. She worked with the bodies and the organizations that would work with her, and she again was able to establish and maintain relationships and friendships across the color line in the spiritualist religion. Both of these women are, in my humble opinion, great pioneers of spiritualism and the representation of who we are as spiritualists. And that despite all of the challenges, um, they still persevered and moved on in the name of spiritualism. They never gave up the religion and the belief of the power and manifestation and I am at a loss for words of what spiritualism can and could be for others. Then that concludes my talk to myself. I have no idea how long I've talked. Good luck in watching it. Peace and love until our next talk. I don't know when that's going to be, but keep an eye out. If you happen to find my channel, feel free to subscribe so you'll be notified when the next talk happens. Peace, love, and prosperity to you all.